Alexander Reed, the wealthiest of America's billionaire heirs, had everything: money, power, and a supermodel fiancée who looked perfect. However, he was plagued by a fundamental doubt. Was his fiancée, Celeste, in love with him, or motivated by self-interest? He devised a radical plan that would surprise everyone. With the complicity of his personal doctor, he faked a terrible accident, allegedly leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. His goal was to see Celeste's reaction to his new condition, in a wheelchair, dependent on others, stripped of his aura of power. But the events of the following days left him stunned. While Celeste revealed her true nature, another person in the mansion, someone he had always considered insignificant, demonstrated an all-consuming love so pure and selfless that it forever changed his view of life. Who was this mysterious figure who loved him genuinely for who he was? And what was her reaction when she discovered it was all a ruse? Alexander Reed was sitting in his panoramic office on the 40th floor of the tower that bore his name in Manhattan, gazing at New York City spread out before him like a kingdom of which he was the absolute monarch. At 30, he had not only inherited the Reed family's financial empire, but had tripled it in 5 years, rising to become the wealthiest American under 35. He had everything money could buy: a $60 million mansion in Connecticut, a collection of sports cars, yachts, a private jet, residences in every global capital, and most importantly, he had Celeste Moreno, the most sought-after supermodel in the U.S. Engaged for 2 years, they were, according to every magazine, the country's most glamorous couple. Nevertheless, on this September evening, Alexander felt a profound emptiness, a thought that had haunted him for months. Did Celeste truly love him, or was she only seduced by his wealth and influence? The clues were subtle but glaring. The way her face lit up for expensive jewelry, but closed off during intimate conversations. The way she disappeared when he was having difficult days, only to reappear at social events. The fact that she never cared about his thoughts, his doubts, or his anxieties. Alexander analyzed all this with the same rigor he applied to business, and his conclusion was bitter. He was in love with a woman who saw him only as a provider of luxury. That night, a crazy idea sprouted in his mind. If Celeste genuinely loved him, would she continue to do so if he were no longer the powerful Alexander Reed everyone admired? He contacted Dr. Jonathan Miller, his personal physician and one of his few true friends. When Miller arrived, Alexander revealed the most daring plan of his life, faking paralysis to test Celeste's love. The doctor, initially stunned and convinced he had misunderstood, began to seriously consider the proposal when he saw the determination mixed with fragility in his childhood friend's eyes. Alexander specified that he wanted to observe Celeste's reaction to seeing him confined to a wheelchair, dependent on others' care, stripped of the appeal of success. Technically it was feasible. Miller could falsify reports, cite spinal cord injuries following a car accident, while leaving a glimmer of hope for recovery. That night, Alexander did not sleep, watching Celeste, who was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the drama unfolding. The next day, everything was orchestrated down to the smallest detail. Miller drafted fake medical documents, briefed trusted nurses, and had credible medical equipment installed at the mansion. Alexander called Celeste, who was in Miami for a photo shoot, describing the details of a terrible accident that had left him paralyzed. Celeste's reaction was what he had anticipated: shock, disbelief, and a promise to return immediately. But Alexander, with his keen ear as a businessman accustomed to detecting what wasn't said, sensed a pause that was too long before the words of comfort, a hesitation that chilled him. When Celeste arrived at the mansion that evening, Alexander was already set up on the stage of his deception, sitting in his wheelchair, awaiting the hour of truth. The crunch of Celeste's Ferrari on the gravel made his heart beat faster than any billion-dollar negotiation, and as he heard her heels approaching the door, he still didn't know that the real surprise wouldn't come from Celeste, but from another person living under his roof, whom he had always considered virtually invisible. Celeste entered the mansion like a star on a red carpet, despite the tragic circumstances. Her Louboutin heels clacked on the Carrara marble as she approached Alexander in his wheelchair. She wore a vibrant red Chanel suit, her hair perfectly styled despite the rushed trip, her makeup flawless. A truly distressed woman would not have dressed as if for a photo shoot. She threw herself onto his knees in a theatrical voice, but Alexander noticed she was careful not to wrinkle her outfit. When he explained that doctors were talking about months or even years of recovery with the possibility of an incomplete cure, he saw a shadow cross Celeste's eyes, a flash of disappointment so fleeting it was almost imperceptible. Celeste's words sounded false, recited like an automatic response. She avoided his gaze, her eyes scanning the room as if she were already thinking about something else. When Alexander mentioned that he would need constant assistance for months, Celeste hastened to assert that she would help him, but immediately began listing her pre-scheduled professional commitments. Less than 24 hours after learning about the accident, she was already detailing reasons why she couldn't stay by his side: the contract with Dior, the Cartier campaign in Greece, the Milan fashion show. While Celeste spoke, Alexander noticed the discreet sound of someone in the adjacent room. It was Emily Lawrence, the housekeeper from Massachusetts who had worked at the mansion for 3 years. A 32-year-old woman, always discreet and efficient, who blended into the background with her average height, her constantly pulled back brown hair, and her simple, functional clothes. Emily entered, carrying a tea tray, and for the first time in years, Alexander truly looked at her. There was genuine concern in her blue eyes that sharply contrasted with Celeste's attitude. With a thoughtful and natural gesture, she adjusted a cushion behind his back. Celeste watched the scene with obvious impatience, claiming urgent calls she needed to make to her agent. She left the room, leaving behind only a trail of expensive perfume and a feeling of emptiness. Emily stayed, silently tidying the room. Alexander asked her to remain for a moment, confessing that he needed company. For the first time in 3 years, they exchanged words as two human beings, not as an employer and his employee. Emily sat down naturally near him, listening to him complain about feeling pathetic. She replied that she didn't think so at all, that he was going through a very difficult ordeal and needed people who truly loved him. Those words affected Alexander more than any declaration of love from Celeste. There was a sincerity in Emily that he had never noticed, a capacity to see beyond appearances that moved him. The following night Celeste slept in the guest room, she said, not to disturb him. Alexander stayed awake, contemplating the unexpected turn his plan was taking. Celeste had revealed her true nature in less than 24 hours, superficial, self-interested, incapable of affection when the situation got complicated. But the real revelation was Emily. In a few hours of false invalidity, this discreet woman had shown more attention and humanity than Celeste ever had. The next day, Celeste left for Milan as planned, barely concealing her relief at escaping the uncomfortable situation. Alexander watched her get into her Ferrari, and for the first time in 2 years, felt no sorrow seeing her drive away. What he didn't know was that from the kitchen window, Emily was watching the same scene with an expression of sadness and indignation that would have surprised anyone who saw her. The days following Celeste's departure revealed a reality to Alexander that he had never suspected. While Celeste sent sporadic messages, citing reasons to prolong her absence, Emily became his constant presence, silent but essential. Every morning at 7 she entered with breakfast prepared exactly as he liked it: scrambled eggs, a double espresso, warm croissants, freshly squeezed orange juice. But it was her manner that struck him: gentle, natural gestures, without the slightest trace of sacrifice or constraint. Emily had hands damaged by work, but her movements were incredibly soft. She helped him without ever making him feel diminished, spoke to him without pity, always treating him as a whole person despite his apparent condition. One day, Alexander asked her why she had come to work so far from her native Massachusetts. Emily hesitated, then told him that her younger sister had needed a very expensive heart operation. In Massachusetts, the waiting lists were too long, so she had come to the New York area where housekeeper salaries were higher. The operation 2 years earlier had been a success, and now Clara was studying medicine in Boston to become a cardiac surgeon. Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. This woman had sacrificed everything to save her sister, leaving her home region and family to care for a rich stranger, and he had never even noticed her. In the following days, Alexander began to know details about Emily that had always been there: how she hummed New England folk tunes while cleaning, how she read literary classics during her breaks, how she spoke 3 languages and had a literature degree she had never mentioned. On the 5th day, when Alexander faked back pain, Emily didn't hesitate for a second. She would sleep in the armchair in his room so she could assist him. That night she barely slept, getting up every hour to check if he was all right, adjusting his blankets, bringing him water without him even asking. Around 3 in the morning, believing him asleep, Emily leaned closer and smoothed a lock of his hair with infinite delicacy. Then she whispered so quietly that he barely heard her, "Please get well soon. I can't stand to see you like this." In that sentence there was such genuine pain, such pure affection, that Alexander had to clench his teeth not to betray his act. Emily loved him, not his money or his status, but him, Alexander, even when he was broken and dependent. The next morning, when Emily brought him his breakfast with the same smile, Alexander looked at her with entirely new eyes. This woman had spent 3 years caring for him, with a devotion that far exceeded the simple professional framework. When Alexander asked her what she would do if he never recovered, Emily looked him straight in the eye with surprising intensity. She told him he was already perfect as he was, that disability didn't define a person, that he was still Alexander Reed, intelligent, kind, able to make people laugh, generous. His legs had nothing to do with his true nature. And when Alexander asked what would happen if he needed assistance forever, Emily replied without the slightest hesitation, "Then I'll be here forever." At that moment Alexander understood that he had found something he didn't even know he was looking for. Not only true love, but a person who saw him for who he really was, and loved him precisely for it. But what he didn't know was that Emily had begun to have doubts, and that the truth, when it came out, would have consequences neither of them could imagine. Emily Lawrence was not naive. With a literature degree and speaking 4 languages, she especially possessed that feminine instinct that made her notice details others missed. And certain details about Alexander's accident didn't convince her. Firstly, Alexander seemed too physically fit for someone who had suffered severe spinal trauma. His leg muscles showed no signs of atrophy. Secondly, his reflexes were perfect. When she was vacuuming, Alexander instinctively pulled his feet away if there was a risk of hitting them. Thirdly, she had caught him moving his toes in his sleep. But the clue that intrigued her the most was the discovery, while cleaning his office, of medical documents carelessly left on the table. Having assisted her sister during her illness, Emily was familiar with medical terminology. The files seemed too vague to her, as if written by a non-specialist in spinal trauma. On the evening of the 7th day, Emily made a decision. She waited for Alexander to fall asleep, then went to his office. She knew the combination to the safe hidden behind the Monet painting, his mother's date of birth. What she found there left her speechless. There was a contract with Dr. Miller for an unconventional medical consultation service. Email exchanges between Alexander and the doctor discussing a convincing staging and a behavioral test, invoices for the rental of the wheelchair and fake medical equipment. Emily collapsed into the armchair, documents in hand, feeling her world crumble. Everything was a sham, the accident, the paralysis, her own suffering seeing him like that. Alexander had orchestrated everything to test Celeste. She had been just collateral damage, the involuntary witness to a cruel experiment. The most humiliating thing was having fallen in love with him precisely during that week of false care. She had spent sleepless nights worrying, praying for his recovery, dreaming of an impossible future. Silent tears rolled down her cheeks as she read the last document, a detailed plan on how to reveal the truth gradually to minimize relational damage. Alexander had even planned how to manipulate her after deceiving her. Emily put everything back, went up to her room, and packed her bags. She left a formal letter of resignation on the kitchen table, took her belongings, and called a taxi. It was 3 in the morning when she left the mansion for the last time, silently closing the door behind her. But Alexander was not asleep. The feeling of guilt and the growing awareness of his feelings for Emily kept him awake. He heard the taxi drive away and rushed to the window, just in time to see the headlights disappear into the night. He found the empty room and the letter in the kitchen, a few formal lines of resignation that broke his heart. At 8 in the morning he called Dr. Miller, panicked. Emily had discovered everything and was gone. He had to find her. Miller suggested that maybe it was for the best, that the plan had gone too far, but Alexander yelled that he didn't care about Celeste anymore. He had fallen in love with Emily. This woman had loved him while believing him paralyzed. She had cared for him as if he were the most important person in the world, and he had rewarded her with the cruelest of lies. Finding Emily Lawrence in a city of 11 million inhabitants, with no contact information, proved more difficult than any financial operation Alexander had ever conducted. And as the days passed without news, he understood that he had lost the most precious thing he had ever owned, at the very moment he realized he couldn't live without her. Alexander discovered that being one of the richest men in America meant nothing when what you're looking for is a person who has every reason in the world to hide from you. Emily had vanished from New York as if she had never set foot there, and every day without finding her was torture. He immediately ended the paralysis charade, walking normally again, but ironically he felt more paralyzed than before. Paralyzed by remorse, by the fear of having lost the woman he loved forever. He hired 3 private detective agencies, placed ads in newspapers, and checked all the modest hotels, but Emily seemed to have evaporated. The only thing he found out was that she had withdrawn all her savings, $25,000 saved over 3 years. On the 5th day, he received a call that froze him. Celeste was back from Milan, stunned to find him walking. Alexander had completely forgotten her existence. The woman for whom he had set up this whole staging now seemed insignificant to him. When Celeste enthusiastically asked him if they were going to Monaco as planned before the accident, without even asking about his week of paralysis, Alexander definitively took the measure of her superficiality. He ended their relationship on the spot. That evening, absolutely alone in his mansion, he had an idea. If he couldn't find Emily directly, perhaps he could locate her through her sister, Clara, who was studying medicine in Boston. He used his influence to get information from New England universities. After 2 days of searching, he found Clara Lawrence, 26, a fifth-year student at Boston University, specializing in pediatric cardiac surgery. Without thinking, he took his private jet to Boston. He found Clara in the university library poring over cardiac anatomy books. The resemblance to Emily was striking, the same blue eyes, the same delicate features. When he introduced himself as Emily's former employer, Clara's expression became icy and wary. She told him that Emily wasn't angry with him. She was devastated. She had cried for 3 days upon arriving back in Massachusetts. She had discovered everything he had done, how he had deceived and used her for his cruel games. Alexander begged her to tell him where Emily was, claiming that he loved her. Clara gave a bitter laugh. So, that was his way of loving, making her fall in love while he faked paralysis, playing with her feelings to test another woman. Alexander sat down heavily, crushed by the weight of his guilt. Clara, observing the sincerity of his pain, then told him that if he truly loved Emily, he should leave her alone. Emily deserved someone who wouldn't lie to her, who wouldn't manipulate her, who would treat her with the respect she deserved from the very first moment. Alexander admitted she was right, that Emily deserved much better than him. He only asked her to convey that he regretted his actions more than words could express, and that if there were a way to undo what he had done, he would give anything for that possibility. Alexander returned to New York with an even heavier heart. Perhaps the most loving thing to do was precisely to leave Emily in peace, to allow her to rebuild her life away from the pain he had inflicted. But what Alexander didn't know was that Emily, in her small New England boarding house, had heard every word of the message Clara had relayed, and those words had rekindled a flame she thought was extinguished forever. 2 weeks after Alexander's return from Boston, life at the Connecticut mansion had become an emotional desert. Alexander worked mechanically, barely ate, and slept little. He had dismissed all the staff and lived alone in this immense residence that now seemed like a golden tomb. Every room reminded him of Emily. The kitchen where she prepared his meals with love, the living room where they had their first real conversation, his bedroom where she had watched over him with infinite devotion while he lied brazenly. One gray November morning, the doorbell rang. Alexander found a delivery man with an express package from Massachusetts. The sender was Clara Lawrence. Inside were a letter and a small object wrapped in tissue paper. The letter was handwritten. Emily was returning something that belonged to him and had one thing to say to him, but only if he had truly changed. If he was interested, she would be in the Giverny Gardens the next day at 3 o'clock, at the spot where they had met for the first time. Alexander unwrapped the object, and his heart stopped. It was the small silver cross his mother had given him on his 16th birthday, the only piece of jewelry he owned with sentimental value. During the week of his fake paralysis, he must have lost it, and Emily had found it. But Emily claimed they had met in the Giverny Gardens the first time. Alexander had no memory of ever seeing her there before her hiring. The next day he arrived at Giverny an hour early, too nervous to wait. At precisely 3 o'clock he saw her arrive. She wore a simple beige coat, her hair down for the first time since he had known her, and looked thinner. They observed each other from a distance, gauging. Emily offered a sad smile and began her story. It had happened 3 years earlier. She had just arrived from Massachusetts, had a strong accent, and was looking for work. She had seen the advertisement for the housekeeper position at his mansion, but was terrified to apply. She was sitting on that very bench, in tears, wondering if she would ever be good enough. Alexander was passing by during his morning jog. He had stopped to ask her if everything was all right. She had confided in him that she was from Massachusetts, looking for work, and scared. He had handed her a tissue and told her that courage was not the absence of fear, but acting despite it. Then he had offered to accompany her to her interview, assuring her he would speak on her behalf to his boss. He didn't know then that he was the future boss himself. Alexander began to remember. The young woman in tears in the gardens, his impulse to help her. Emily explained that she had fallen in love with him that day, with that kind man who had stopped to help a stranger, but by starting to work for him she had discovered a different man, cold, distant, solely focused on money. She had thought she was mistaken. During the week of his fake paralysis, she had rediscovered the man she had fallen in love with 3 years earlier, vulnerable, human, capable of real conversations. That's why the discovery of the deception had hurt her even more deeply. Alexander got up from the bench and knelt before her on the damp grass. He solemnly promised her that he would never lie to her again, would treat her like the queen she was, would love and respect her every day of his life. If she gave him a chance, he would spend the rest of his existence proving to her that she deserved all the love in the world. Emily looked at him kneeling, this powerful man humbling himself for love of her, and felt the wall of pain surrounding her begin to crack. She told him to get up, that people were watching them. He replied that he didn't care about people, that only she mattered. She held out her hand to help him stand up. As their skin touched, both felt the spark that had always been present. Emily gave him one chance, just one. At the first lie, everything would be over forever. Alexander took her hands, looking at her with an intensity that made her heart pound. One chance was all he asked for, and he would use it to show her that true love existed, and that she deserved it more than anyone. They kissed in the Giverny Gardens, at the very spot of their first meeting, while the November sun bathed the scene in a golden light. For the first time in his life, Alexander understood that true wealth is not measured in money or possessions, but in the capacity to love and be loved authentically. 2 years later, they got married in those same gardens, in front of 200 guests, including Clara, who had become a confirmed cardiac surgeon, and all the mansion staff. Emily had kept her simplicity and kindness. Alexander had learned to be the man Emily had seen in him from day one, generous, human, capable of unconditional love. Every time he passed the bench during their Sunday walk, he stopped to thank fate, a love born of kindness, which grew in truth and blossomed in that second chance we all deserve when love is authentic. Because true love sees beyond appearances and material wealth. Sometimes it takes a lie to discover the truth. Sometimes you have to lose everything to understand what really matters. And sometimes the greatest love is the one you aren't looking for, but which finds you when you least expect it. Because sincere love doesn't care about the bank account, but about the account of the heart.